what is the law of time?
Well, the law of time is a very, very, very fundamental law, which we can compare the situation of the law of time to the law of gravity, when before that apple fell from the tree and Newton figured out it was the law of gravity. Gravity, of course, always existed. So it's the same thing with the law of time. The law of time has always existed, but it wasn't until a certain person named Jose Arguelles came along and along with his wife was in the Museum of Time in Geneva, Switzerland, where we realized, hey, this ain't time, this is mechanical time. Real time is not mechanical. The law of time says that the actual nature of time is to synchronize things, that the law of time is the law of synchronization. And very simply stated, the law of time says that energy factored by time equals art. That is to say, the universe is basically a harmony, which is why it says energy factored by time equals art. And it is a harmony because time is continuously, instant to instant, synchronizing everything in the universe. And what we experience, for instance, as synchronicities are not singular exceptions, actually. They are actually the rule and the norm and the actual nature of reality. It's because our minds have been cramped and bent, as it were, by artificial mechanistic time, that synchronicity seems odd, peculiar, or special whenever it occurs. So,
okay, now, Jose, let me stop you there, because I don't want to lose the listeners here with too much technical talk.
Yeah.
What you're attempting to describe as the law of time that's natural is the fact that our calendar is basically disharmonious and fallacious, the way we live our lives in consciousness according to the calendar, because the moon does not revolve around the Earth 12 times a year. It revolves around the Earth 13 times a year, right?
Correct. Absolutely correct.
Now, how does that? Let's just start simply with that so people can keep up with this. Explain why the calendar, the way we live it, is out of time with the natural planetary movements.
Well, the calendar, as we live it, is an irregular standard of measure. In other words, a standard of measure has even units. You know, a ruler, every inch on the ruler is equal to every other inch on the ruler. Mm-hmm. The standard of measure of the Gregorian calendar, the calendar we use, does not have even units of measure. It has very uneven units of measure, and they are not, they are in no regular pattern whatsoever.
In other words, some months are 31 days, some are 30, some are 28.
Exactly.
And what that does then is disrupt the flow of the harmony of equal measures of time relating to the consciousness.
Exactly. And time is of the mind. You know, space you can touch, you can feel, you can taste it.
Yeah.
But you can't do that with time. That's because time is of the mind. So if you have a crooked measure of time, that actually is creating a crooked measure of your mind.
And as Einstein said, time is an invention of the human mind.
Yes.
Time isn't a measure that exists like a 360-degree circle.
No, it isn't. That's a total misperception or illusion which has been perpetrated for 5,000 years, creating the conundrum that we are living in today.
Now, the Gregorian calendar was not where this all began. It began, according to your research, with the Babylonians.
It began with the Babylonian division of time, according to a 360-degree circle. A 360-degree circle is nothing but a division of a two-dimensional plane in space. What does that have to do with time?
Right. So when you put a flat surface and you draw a circle 360 degrees, they are making what is a 4, 5, 6-dimensional reality, a 2-dimensional reality.
Absolutely correct. A flat plane.
Okay.
And we live in that result of that is that we live in flat time. We live in linear time, which is it becomes a belief system, but it has no real basis in reality.
Okay, understood. Now, before the Babylonian was the Sumerian, correct?
Yes.
What was the time spectrum?
Well, actually, this whole thing actually began with the Sumerians. The Babylonians inherited it. This whole thing began about 3100 BC, to be very precise.
Mm-hmm. Now, why did they do it this way? Yeah. If the Sumerian civilization was aware of other planetary reality and were, as my research has taught me, as sophisticated, if not more so, than we are today, why would they have been so wrong in measuring time as it relates to a 360-degree circle?
Yeah, I think it has to do with issues other than time. I think it has to do with issues of power and control, and basically the creation of male dominance and the suppression of the female and the suppression of the number 13.
Yeah, let's just clarify that. The suppression of the female would be that to cut down 12 moons, to cut down 13 moons a year to 12 moons a year, the moon being the feminine.
Correct.
This is the way they achieved male dominance.
Correct.
And so you think that this male dominant idea went as far back as 3,100 years? Correct.
It went back to 3,100 before Christ, 5,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Now, you have very, I think, successfully outlined the events of the human race in relation to the inevitability of real time, not the time that we're living in, right?
Yes.
All right, let's go, if we could, to the Mayan and the science of the ancient Mayans' opinion of time. Theirs matches what you think it is, right?
Yes, exactly. The Mayans understood that time is a factor of synchronization. This is why they utilized so many different calendars simultaneously, because they were involved in a process of synchronizing their consciousness with the Earth and the solar consciousness and with the galactic consciousness. They were living what we might call a multiple-phased, multi-dimensional time reality.
Okay, let's go to, what was the Mayan sage's name?
Paravotar.
Votan. Who was he?
Yeah, well, he was a great guy. He was, as far as my understanding of it goes, he was an interplanetary, interdimensional soul traveler. The Mayans were not originally from this third-dimensional physical plane reality. They have been through the galaxy and through the universe. They are what we might call time engineers or time navigators at the core. And Paravotar was one of the chief of these Mayan time navigators or time engineers who had scouted this system, our solar system and our planetary order, for some time in a higher dimensional form. And then when the time, he had been also partly responsible for the implanting of the Mayan civilization maybe 2,500 years ago. And then when the time was ripe between the years of the Christian era of 603 and 683 for 80 years, he incarnated at a place called Palenque, or which was then also known as Na-Chan, the House of the Serpent. And particularly during a 52-year cycle between 631 and 683, he laid out the codes of time. This was a very particularly harmonic point in the whole Mayan description of time. And he harmonized himself with all of the timing cycles, and his consciousness was harmonized with the timing cycles. And toward the end of his life, he said, how am I going to leave this knowledge for the future when it's going to be really important? You'll notice the Mayans are on the other side of the ocean from the old world and from the Babylonian influence. They were in the new world, in the jungles. They're hidden away from everything else. So he devised a masterful tomb, which he had built. It took after he died, it took 9 years to complete its construction. It looks like the pyramid of the inscriptions at the Palenque. For 1,260 years, this tomb lay buried within this pyramid, very, very skillfully and successfully hidden. And then the archaeologist Alberto Rus, on top of the pyramid inscriptions in 1949, noticed a stone with interesting markings. He lifted it up, and beneath the stone at first was what appeared to be rubble, and then over there in the corner there was a piece of tile. He brushed the dirt away from the tile, and it looked like the top part of a tile tube. He said, "I must dig." And so he began to dig very carefully, of course. It took him 3 years to excavate. He found a secret stairway that went from the top of the temple to the top of the pyramid to a place beneath the level of the plaza, about 5 feet beneath the level of the plaza outside. There was a large, the tube had come down and went into a wall, and at first he couldn't even find a door, but there was one large kind of trapezoidal-shaped stone, and one of the workers' pickaxes went beneath it and found that it just swung right open. This is real Indiana Jones stuff. It swung open, and he looked in, and boom, there it was, the most colossal, most interesting vault. This is the most interesting tomb in all of human history. And it's comparable, of course, to the king's chamber and so on in the Great Pyramid at Egypt. He opened that door, and this guy, he was Alberto Rus. He was a Cuban. He was a communist, a Marxist guy. But he said when he opened that door, he never felt anything mystical in his life, but he felt it then. He said he could feel the thoughts of the people who had been in there 1,260 years before when that temple was dedicated. He could feel his thought. And
who was this guy, Jose?
Which is Paravotar, or
no, the man who did the dig.
The man who did the dig. Alberto Rus was a Cuban archaeologist who had been assigned by the Mexican government, the INA, the Institute for National Institute for Archaeology and History. He had been assigned to be the head archaeologist at Palenque in 1947, and Palenque had been rediscovered late in the 18th century, and by the time that Alberto Rus was there, it had been considered to be more and more one of the more remarkable Mayan sites, and so he was just on the job. And when he discovered that tomb, he, of course, got international acclaim. It turned out to be one of the greatest archaeological finds in all of history, the greatest one in all of the Americas. He lived until about 1978. His son, Alberto Rus, who's also named Alberto Rus, a very good friend of mine. He's also one of the leaders of the Rainbow Nation around the world.
Okay, now let me get to what he found, and let's get to something that's more identifiable with our leaders. You call 9/11 the inevitable event.
Correct.
Now, was the inevitable event marked in this tomb as to it being inevitable that it would occur?
Well, the tomb has a prophecy associated with it, and the prophecy makes it very clear that we are living today in this modern world, as we call it, in a totally false and irregular time, and have created a whole artificial structure, the technosphere. And in that, it has a prophecy of the 13 and the 28, the 13 moon calendar, 28 days. It also has the prophecy of the 7 years of prophecy, which was between 1993 and 2000. It says if the prophecy, if people are still living in the artificial time after that year 2000, that then we'll be entering what is referred to as the harrowing of hell.
All right, but now, Jose, if the measurement of time is not as we have been experiencing it. Why does it say 2000? Is that because it's been translated to what we are living with?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And see, the Mayan timing system understands that time is the fourth dimension.
Right.
The fourth dimension encompasses and includes the third dimension, and all third-dimensional timing standards are also enclosed or encompassed by the fourth-dimensional timing standard. For instance,
well, even Einstein said this.
Yeah, and Einstein said something else. He said a lot of interesting things, but one thing that was brought to my attention the other day was he said that the only mistake he made in his life, he said this towards the end of his life, was that he went in the direction of quantum physics. He would have preferred, he said, and it would have been more correct if he had gone into the cosmology of time.
Yeah, right. Well, Freud even said, if I had it all to do over, I'd be a parapsychologist, not a psychiatrist.
Yeah, very smart.
Right. Now, let's talk about this inevitable event in relation to, and let's not get too technical. They really have to read your book to understand this. But the difference between the technosphere, the biosphere, and do you pronounce it the noosphere? Noosphere.
Right.
All right, let's do an explanation of that.
Okay, biosphere, very simple. Sphere of life. The biosphere refers to the all of life as a single unity from the plankton to us,
right.
As one single continuum, and all of the support system of life. And this constitutes the biosphere. This is the natural evolving order that's been here on Earth for a couple billion years. It's interesting. The amount of life, the quantity of life has always remained constant, but it's continuously mutating.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and it goes into points of crisis, and what we're experiencing right now is a peak crisis of the biosphere.
Mm-hmm.
According to the people who understood and first began to develop the laws of the biosphere, which included a Russian named Vernadsky and a Frenchman named Teilhard de Chardin, whom you may have heard of.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes, okay. Both Vernadsky and de Chardin coined the word noosphere, and they both said that the biosphere was now verging into a new mutational state, which would be the noosphere. The noosphere means the mental envelope of the Earth, the consciousness of the Earth.
Mm-hmm.
This mental envelope of the Earth is dependent on the evolution of the human species into a condition of universal telepathy.
Which also means including the fourth, fifth, sixth dimensions of reality.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Which we are incapable of commonly entering into because, as I said, our minds are cramped and constipated by living in artificial time that keeps us in the third dimension exclusively, in what we might call the prison of third-dimensional time.
Now, stop right here.
I will.
Jose, and explain the details of why, because it was very impressive to me that when we are discussing in our personal lives with our friends, etc., where to go, at what time, and what month, and all of that, that's where we can never really be sure. Does February have 28 days? Is something else 30 days? Is something else 31? So what that does is, in effect, interrupt the flow of consciousness.
Yes, it does. It creates, it obstructs the natural intuitive flow of consciousness. Mm-hmm. And it's this disruption of this natural intuitive flow of consciousness which becomes cumulative. Mm-hmm. And so at one point, it contributes, the cumulativeness of it contributes to the fact that then we start needing artificial aids to help us, to assist us, and we create an increasingly artificial civilization.
So hence we have the technosphere.
Yeah, and this technosphere is purely the product of our living in a world that's constructed from artificial time. Mm-hmm. This, if you go back, where did this begin? This began at the end of the 16th century. The Gregorian calendar that we use was dates from 1582, the Gregorian calendar reform, And it was approximately, and it's really just the same as the Julian calendar, the calendar Julius Caesar created 44 BC.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time that the Gregorian calendar that reform was enacted, at that very same time, the mechanical clock was perfected. And the combination of these two timing standards, the Gregorian calendar, the calendar of everyday life, which is the macro organizing principle of our everyday life, in combination with the mechanical clock, creates an unconscious timing frequency, which I've referred to as the 1260, irregular 12-month calendar, mechanical 60-minute hour. This unconscious frequency begins to affect the genetic code of the human race, so that what happens is you have first the creation of what's called the scientific revolution, which is really the materialist scientific revolution. And that in the 17th century, the big deal was this. The idea was that the universe is a clock. God was a clockmaker. He made the clock. When the clock was finished, he fell asleep, and the scientists came in and took over. Mm-hmm. And when the scientific revolution was complete early in the 18th century, it spawned the Industrial Revolution.
Right.
Okay. And with the Industrial Revolution, you'll notice one thing, that about 1750, that the human species had attained to 500 million people. And that took several thousand years to build up from around 100 million, say, at the beginning of history, 5,000 years ago, to 1750. Over about 5,000 years it took to go from 100 million to 500 million. Well, in the 250 years since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the population has increased 12 times.
And you're saying that that is the failure of the human civilization to become synchronized with itself in the correct time of universal nature. Yeah. So therefore we did not practice self-regulating population.
No, we didn't. What we did, we actually began when we started to create the machine is a product of ourselves, and therefore it has the biological attributes of multiplication and propagation. The machine goes faster than us. So the human species, the machine propagates faster and faster, and the human species has to keep up with it, and so it propagates faster and faster.
I see. So the machines that we've created, the technology that we've created, is an expression of our living in artificial time, which then bounces back to our going faster and faster.
Correct. And so you can just see this acceleration. In 90 years after the Industrial Revolution began, the human population doubled. In another 90 years, it went to 1 billion in 1840, and then another billion by 1930. So it was 2 billion people then. Well, since 1930, it's increased 3 times that to we're over 6 billion people now, and that's in less than some 70 years or so. That's an exponential increase, and of course everything else has gone up rapidly. We are now at an exponential curve. And so when you get to this point, see, this program of 2000 was is in the calendar. A calendar is a programming device. All of the beliefs, all of the customs, all the institutions of the society that uses that calendar are programmed into that calendar.
So our belief system is determined by the calendar we live by.
Correct. Yeah. You can't think of all these things, September in the rain or July 4th. Take away the calendar, where is that? It isn't. And, in reality, it doesn't exist. It's an artificial thing.
So what you're saying is this calendar, this Gregorian calendar that we live by, is representing an imbalance, basically, in the moon and the solar energy, because it is negating the fact that the moon should be recognized as going 13 times a year around the world.
Correct. That's absolutely correct. That's a scientific fact, too, that that happens that way. You know, our measurements of the moon are subjective, and because we're looking at the moon from Earth, we're not seeing the moon how it is in space, how it actually is. And so, you know, that's why there's different measurements of the moon. There's the synodic measurement that says from new moon to new moon is 29.5 days.
Mm-hmm.
But there's the sidereal measurement that says where the moon is from where it appears in one point in the sky and when it returns to that same point in the sky. Well, that's only 27 days. So you look at that, the mean between those two, 28 days is the actual cycle of the moon. That's the female menstruation cycle, the moon cycle.
Right, and that's the cycle of procreation. So we wouldn't be so overpopulated if we were recognizing 13 moons instead of 12.
Exactly, because then our minds would be harmonized in that standard, mm-hmm. and our biology would be reharmonized in that standard, and we would know when our fertility points are, when we want to have a baby, we would do it then. When we didn't, we wouldn't do it then.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
No, I understand. Very important. So the moon rotates around the Earth 13 times during the time that it takes the Earth to orbit the sun once.
Absolutely correct.
So therefore we need to have a solar lunar calendar.
Yes, and that's exactly what the 13 moon 28-day calendar is. You'll notice that in what's called the Old World, in the Hebrew and the Chinese and the Islamic societies, they use a lunar calendar. Well, that lunar calendar, it's interesting. A lot of people think, oh, the moon, lunar, that's female. But you'll notice that these are heavy patriarchal societies.
Why is that?
Well, because there's two reasons for that. One, that they're measuring the synodic cycle of the moon, new moon to new moon, and it's a tricky business. They create there's a male priest class that's in control of that. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is that...
Yeah, but why would a male priest class in control of the lunar calendar make it patriarchal? Just because they're in control?
Because they're in control, and also because that lunar calendar does not synchronize with the solar orbit. Mm-hmm. That's another thing. And so you create a type of lopsided or one-sided society. You create. It's all. You remember, we go back to this Sumerian Babylonian male control thing.
Right.
That's all inherited then, because of the 12, the number 12. Mm-hmm. The lunar, because if you use a 29-day measure, that you get 12 29-day lunations, creating during the year, but that's only 354 days. It's 11 days shy of an actual solar orbit.
Right.
So then there's all this type of messing around. You'll notice, like, for instance, in the Jewish calendar, Rosh Hashanah, 1 year is in the year 2000 was like around September 28th, and then the year 2001 it was September 17th, mm-hmm. and then this year it was on September 6th.
So what it does is create a glitch in the flow of human consciousness.
Yeah, so it creates that type of thing, and then the male priest class remains in control of that.
While the society has glitches in its consciousness.
Yes, exactly, and then you see it's not properly synchronized with the solar orbit.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so they don't actually have a solar count; they just have a lunar count.
So our belief systems are functions of time and our calendar.
Exactly.
And that's what's causing this need for safety in technology. Would you say that?
Well, that's kind of like that. That's what I would call a self-defeating feedback loop.
Right.
Because you go for safety in technology, and the technology creates more problems, and it also creates further alienation from nature. If you could see like a time-lapse movie of the Earth during the time in which the technosphere was actually created, which was like from the Second World War to the present, you would see the human race completely speeding up its time, while the time of nature just kept on its regular pace.
Mm-hmm.
That as the human race speeded up its time, you'd see it spreading, all these little technological extrusions all around the biosphere, tying it up like the Lilliputians around Gulliver.
Right.
And consuming it. It's like a cancer, causing species extinction, causing global warming, all this, and yet at the same time thinking it's progressing.
So you could say that this technosphere that we falsely live in, but nevertheless think is our reality,
yes,
produced, well, you could say it produced the military-industrial complex.
It is the military-industrial complex. That's the very interesting thing about it. The targets of the 9/11 were the Pentagon and, of course, the World Trade Center. The World Trade Center was actually the hub, the pineal gland of the technosphere.
Yeah, it was the center of materialism.
The very, very, very center of it, the Twin Tower of Babel. So the targets were obviously very, very well chosen symbolically because of that, to hit the military-industrial establishment right dead center. And so, but that military-industrial establishment is totally the function of this artificial time. So hitting those two key points meant that the artificial time had reached its limit.
Yeah.
And
let me ask you, Jose, do you think that these terrorists were unconsciously programmed by the timing of technosphere?
Yeah, I believe that they were unconsciously. I believe that they were unconsciously programmed by what I would call the Noosphere, the mind of the Earth, because.
Oh, to get rid of this technosphere.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
So you would say that is what happened at 9/11.
Yes, that was the beginning of it. And
that was what you call the inevitable event.
And it was inevitable because anything artificial will inevitably be destroyed by the truth. The truth will eat away at it at one point. Anything artificial can only go so far. The technosphere can only go so far before it would have to be done in, because if it went farther, it would destroy its own means of support. And the means of support, that what supports the technosphere, of course, is the living biomass of humanity, which we are all, whether we're conscious of it or not, we are still all part of the biosphere. Mm-hmm.
And with this Mayan calendar, which was a lunar solar calendar, yes?
Yes, lunar solar galactic.
Okay, so now that's the question I want to ask you in a minute, but that lunar solar Mayan calendar, which we all who have done research know about, says that the end of this artificial time and the end of this technosphere that we live in will happen in 2012.
Yeah, the winter solstice 2012 is the end of what's called the Great Cycle, which is the Mayan measure of the duration of what we call historical civilization. The 9/11, the inevitable event, happened as a mercy from God to give us, from that point, 11 years before 2012.
So you would call 9/11 a warning?
Yes, absolutely.
Uh-huh.
It was a warning. I call it a mercy from God.
Now, that's interesting. Let's get into the galactic aspect of that in a minute, and we'll get into the Quran in a minute.
Yes.
But why was Hiroshima, in your opinion, more of a critical event than that? Because it entered the atomic age?
Yeah, we entered the atomic age with Hiroshima, and what Hiroshima did with the entry into the atomic age, it also released, for the first time in the history of the Earth, what's called steady-state background radiation, which actually then began to cause a mutation of the species. That began, from that point, you began the mutation that leads up to 2012.
And it also kept the world from blowing itself up through fear, which is no way to keep the world from blowing itself up.
Yeah, exactly. But it also produced the beginning of what we call the Age of Terror, because he who has the bombs holds the balance of terror.
Right.
And the history of the world since 1945 has been this very, very edgy dance around the ultimate terror.
And you believe in your belief system that all nature is designed to produce a sense of appreciation for beauty or something like that.
Yes, exactly.
In other words, everything works for the purposeful good.
Yes, everything has what we might call an intrinsic goodness and an intrinsic taste for beauty built into it. As I said, the law of time says energy factored by time equals art. That's energy factored by natural time. Mm-hmm. Energy factored by artificial time creates entropic chaos.
Mm-hmm. So this second law of thermodynamics is not real.
No. They're all functions. I think that's why Einstein said he would have preferred to have gone into the cosmology of time.
Right. Now, Verdadsky was a Russian physicist, was he? He began as a crystallographer. He was a geochemist. Right.
And then he began to see that how the different cycles of nature create a what he called a unitary phenomenon. And this unitary phenomenon is...
So that's the unified field theory.
That would be kind of like the unified field theory, right. And we don't know much about it here in this country, but I began to study this rather intensely after the harmonic convergence, and I spent a bit of time traveling in Russia and speaking with many scientists there during the 90s, and realized, Vernadsky at the end of his life in 1945, just before the end of the Second World War, he said, we know everything about the biosphere except for the function of time. He said, and he was one of the few modern scientists to articulate this, he said, our concepts of time are based on concepts of space, and that's not time. We have to find out what time actually is in relationship to the biological cycles of the Earth and of the cosmos itself. And this the Mayans knew about.
Right. Now, you talk about how seismologists in the 80s confirmed that the core of the Earth is a gigantic iron crystal?
Yeah, a gigantic iron octahedron.
Uh-huh. Does that mean 8 sides?
8 sides.
And it's elongated at its ends that point to the north and the south pole.
Correct.
Now, what is all this about polar shifting that so much of us are concerned about?
Well, that has to do with the potential of the imbalance that we have created we've created a total imbalance and a complete stress through the entire structure, the whole system that holds not only the biosphere but the whole Earth together. And of course, with the stuff that's happening with the HAARP and all those kinds of things, that is not helping matters at all.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and we know that the poles have shifted periodically over millions, if not billions, of years. And the question is, are we going to be causing an artificially induced pole shift? And if that happens, that will totally rearrange the electromagnetic field of the Earth. Mm-hmm. It will bring the technosphere to a grinding, destructive halt and probably cause quite a bit of damage to everything else. Mm-hmm. That is part of this artificial civilization. Most of what's in nature will be relatively unbothered.
Right. So the Earth will survive and evolve, whereas those of us who are, I guess you would say, do we basically recoil at the prospect of harmony?
Yes.
And is that because we're products of our own created disharmony?
Yes, we prefer. We definitely do that. I had a Tibetan teacher, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who used to say, we prefer pink three-legged poodles to the real thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, we're very charmed and addicted to our idiosyncrasies and to the quality of disharmony in our life. Books are written about the calendar, and they all recognize the Gregorian calendar as a horribly flawed system, but they all excuse it. Yeah.
There have been some movements towards calendar reform, yes? Didn't the League of Nations?
The League of Nations was the main proponent of calendar reform. That's a very interesting point. In fact, it was one of the main agenda items that the League of Nations had in its brief history between the two world wars.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that the main calendar that was being proposed was the 13-month, 28-day calendar. In fact, 98% of the organizations that were involved in this process were in support of that calendar, including the International Chamber of Commerce, and in the United States, one of the great proponents of it was Eastman Kodak of Kodak and Company.
Mm-hmm.
And
what happened?
Well, what happened was that if you have a 13-month calendar, 28 days each month, that's 364 days. The 365th day, to maintain a perpetual harmonic standard, to maintain that, the 365th day is no day of the week or month at all.
So that would have been a day for meditation and harmony?
Yeah, harmony. Or we could say forgiveness of debts. And so the
Explain to the people the Latin derivative of the word calendar.
Yeah, the calendar means account book, because it's the calends is always in the Julian calendar. There are only two names of days of the month. One is the calends, the first day, and the ides, the 15th day. Mm-hmm. And the calends was the day that you pay your bills. It means an account book. So we live in the philosophy of time as money. Mm-hmm. It was the Vatican that defeated the calendar reform in the 1930s.
Oh,
and
really?
They objected to the day out of time, to the day that was not a day of the week or month at all.
Wasn't that because it would have changed the date of Jesus' resurrection?
Yeah, that would have changed everything. Mm-hmm. And of course, then that gets another interesting point. Who is at that point? It's very interesting. In the 1930s, a lot of the business community was ready to accept a new calendar because it would be easier to keep accounts on a 28-day schedule.
But the Vatican thought they would lose control?
The Vatican thought they'd lose control, and the argument they used was this extra day. They said that if we stopped to observe this day at a time that was no day of the week at all, it would break it would break the succession of the week that was created by God at the beginning of creation, which, of course, is not true. Mm-hmm. But there was enough proper. They said that if we broke the succession of the 7-day week, that the world would fall into chaos, war, disharmony, and terrorism. And that's where we are today.
Well, it was the opposite.
It was the opposite, exactly.
Well, talk a little bit more about, because their arguments must have been refuted and been shown that it would affect the opposite.
Well, no, the main arguments were that the calendar had to be reformed because it was creating disharmony in social life and confusion. But as I'm saying, nonetheless, the Vatican was able to mount this campaign and said that by observing this day out of time, that we would have war and chaos. Well, the opposite happened. I mean, I should say actually that's exactly what has happened, because we didn't change the calendar.
No, understood. But I would think that somebody would present that argument as a refutation of their refutation.
Yeah, well, it didn't happen back then. It wasn't strong enough to happen, and the whole reform movement got diluted, and then the Second World War happened, and the Gregorian calendar was still in place, and its effects, you have to realize that the effects of the calendar are cumulative. In other words, the calendar is a program, and if the Gregorian calendar is the program that has been the sponsor, let's say, of the creation of the technosphere, as the technosphere began to be created, the program became more and more entrenched, and the cumulative effect of it became more and more entrenched. So we might say that the will to change weakened and weakened. Albert Einstein said another thing. He said that since the advent of the nuclear age, everything has changed but the way people think. And as a result, we drift toward unparalleled catastrophe. Mm-hmm. Well, if you change the calendar, you would change the way people think.
Mm-hmm.
And so
in other words, this Gregorian calendar that we live under conditions our minds unconsciously to be hopeless in terms of achieving some kind of resolution for our problems?
Exactly. Let's see, when you're dealing with a standard of measure that is intrinsically inharmonic,
right?
It establishes a program in which there will never be any resolution. And
right.
so, for all the effect of the United Nations, of peace movements, we are farther from peace, from unity now than we have ever been.
And you're saying that what would shift all of this is to go to the lunar calendar, recognizing the movements of the planets, which is the natural law of time.
Yes, exactly. That is really the only thing that's going to help at this point. Everything else has been tried, and the other point is that there's 2 points about this. One is, of course, to put us back on a harmonic standard and to get us reharmonized with ourselves and with nature is very, very critical now. And the other point is that in order to do this, we have to synchronize ourselves. And this to get behind a changing of the calendar that would eliminate the irregular, chaotic standard in favor of a harmonic standard. Just to do that, it would be to draw together all the right, good-minded people on Earth, and that would be more harmonic convergence than the harmonic convergence was. So
the 13-moon, 28-day calendar is this instrument that could be the answer for us to be harmonized and synchronized with the real law of reality.
Yeah, absolutely. It is the instrument. This is going back to that Paravotar. This is the key to the prophecy there. It's coded into the tomb. And it says that for the human species to make it to 2012, and this was the whole point going back to 1987 of the harmonic convergence. The harmonic convergence said, okay, we got the people together, we know how to synchronize. What this means is we got 25 years. What people didn't understand is we had 25 years to 2012, and the prophecy said that in order to get to 2012 in one piece, we have to get out of the materialist civilization and return to living in the cycles of nature. At that point, I didn't know how to do it, but now I know how to do it.
Yeah, if people will listen.
Yes.
Now, what were some of the results of the harmonic convergence besides the fall of the Berlin Wall? Yeah,
well, the stock market crash of 1987 was the first effect, and of course then the
meaning it was the break in the technosphere domination.
Absolutely, because what happened, there was enough of a spiritualized frequency or vibration went up around the world at that point that within 2 months it caused like a kind of cardiac arrest in the materialist belief system to create that stock market crash, which was actually the biggest one in history up to that point.
Right.
And then, of course, it caused the breakup of the whole communist bloc in Eastern Europe, and then the coming down of the Berlin Wall. You know, in the first half of the year 1990, there were numerous newspaper editorials in this country in particular that said, wow, did the harmonic convergence work? It looks like the Cold War's ending. We're getting closer to peace. Gorbachev came to the United States, and he was more popular than Bush when he was in San Francisco, June of 1990, and Dan Rather on his evening TV show showing Gorbachev in San Francisco began his report with some shots of people at the harmonic convergence saying, hey, look, this actually worked.
Yeah, right. So they did acknowledge it. They recognized it.
They recognized it.
But what you're really saying is it wasn't really a harbinger for world peace. It was a harbinger for the technocratic material, let's say world domination of the stock market, the material world, trade, all that stuff.
Yeah.
It was the harbinger of the beginning of the end for that.
Yeah, exactly. And then you see what happened was just after Gorbachev was in San Francisco, then the whole thing with George Bush and Saddam Hussein happened. That was the Kuwait the invasion of Kuwait happened early in August of 1990, and that actually was a part that called into play a very carefully orchestrated plan, let's say, on the part of the military-industrial complex to take control. See, once communism was out of the way, as it were, the stage was set for a complete takeover of the world by the technospheric means.
Well, also a takeover of, in your opinion, world reserves of oil.
Exactly.
So communism was gone. Now we can go get the oil.
Get the oil and make the planet over into our image. So by 1994, you had Samuel P. Huntington's famous dissertation on the coming clash of civilizations, which is basically the coming clash of the West against Islam, because Islam was the holdout against globalization as far as a major ideological bloc, let's say.
Now, I'd like to get to that. Will you come back and we'll do another show, Jose, because I want to get to that and the implications in the Quran.
Love to.
Okay. Thanks so much, Jose. I'll talk to you next week.
Okay, so we'll do it again next week.
Yeah.
Very good.
Thanks so much, Jose.
Okay. Take care, Shirley. It's been great.
Bye-bye.
Love you. Bye.